Opening observation. Little Red Riding Hood. Stories often survive not because they are accurate, but because they are efficient. They reduce complex situations into simple patterns that can be remembered and repeated. Little Red Riding Hood is usually presented as one of these patterns. It is often framed as a story about obedience, danger, and listening to instructions. But structurally, it is something quieter. It is a story about assumptions. The forest is not hostile by default. The wolf does not begin as an obvious threat. The child is not reckless or defiant. Nothing in the story requires violence to occur. The events unfold the way they do because information moves unevenly between characters. One character speaks freely, another listens carefully. In most versions of the story, Little Red Riding Hood's defining trait is not curiosity or courage, it is transparency. She answers questions honestly. She assumes shared intent. She treats conversation as harmless. This is not framed as a choice, it is simply how the world appears to her. The forest is a place you pass through. Strangers are people who ask questions. Words are exchanged without consequence. Under these assumptions, her behavior is consistent. There is no deception because there is no perceived need for it. There is no caution because there is no perceived threat. The wolf, by contrast, operates under a different set of assumptions. He treats information as leverage, conversation as reconnaissance, and time as something that can be manipulated. The story does not punish innocence because it is innocent. It exposes what happens when two incompatible strategies coexist. One strategy depends on mutual honesty, the other does not. This is where many retellings resolve the tension by assigning moral weight. The wolf becomes evil, the child becomes a warning. But if the story is approached differently, something else becomes visible. If Little Red Riding Hood were to change nothing about her personality, but alter only how she handles information, the narrative would not collapse. It would reorganize. The forest would remain uncertain, the wolf would remain present. The risk would not disappear. What would change is not the morality of the story, but its structure. Who knows what? Who reveals what? And when silence becomes more protective than speech. This is not a story about becoming harder or darker. It is a story about what happens when innocence encounters strategy and does not remain untouched. The original strategy. Little Red Riding Hood. In the familiar versions of the story, Little Red Riding Hood does not behave randomly. Her actions follow a clear and internally consistent strategy, even if the story does not describe it that way. She moves through the forest with the expectation that the world she inhabits is broadly cooperative, not perfectly safe but understandable, not benevolent but orderly. Her instructions are simple. She is told where to go and what not to do. These instructions assume a predictable environment. The path is known, the destination is fixed. Deviation is treated as unnecessary rather than dangerous. Within this framework, success depends less on vigilance and more on compliance. This creates a particular relationship to risk. Risk is not something to be managed actively. It is something avoided by following rules. As long as the rules are respected, the world is expected to respond in kind. Danger, when it exists, is external and identifiable. It has a face, it announces itself. Conversation under this strategy is not a tool, it is a social reflex. Questions are answered because they are asked. Information is shared because withholding it would feel unnatural. Silence would require justification. Honesty does not need one. This is not portrayed as naivety. It is a reflection of a social order where trust precedes caution. In such an order, deception is the anomaly, not transparency. Most interactions are assumed to be symmetrical. What one person reveals, another would reveal as well. Within these assumptions, Little Red Riding Hood's behavior is efficient. She does not waste energy on suspicion. She does not anticipate manipulation because manipulation is not part of her mental model of the world. Her attention remains outward rather than defensive. The forest is something to move through, not something to interpret. The wolf enters this system without disrupting it immediately. He does not challenge her assumptions directly. He asks ordinary questions. He adopts the appearance of a participant in the same cooperative order. This allows the existing strategy to continue unchallenged. At no point is Little Red Riding Hood required to make a mistake. She does not violate her instructions in a way that would obviously justify the outcome. The system fails not because she acts incorrectly, but because her strategy is incompatible with the environment she is actually in. Her approach relies on the idea that intentions are legible, that danger reveals itself early, that harmful actors behave differently enough to be recognized in time. When these assumptions hold, transparency is not only safe, it is stabilizing. When they do not, transparency becomes exposure. The original story does not frame this as a strategic failure, it frames it as a moral one. But at a structural level, what breaks is not her character, it is the fit between her assumptions and the conditions of the forest. The strategic shift. Little Red Riding Hood, Machiavelli. If Little Red Riding Hood were to alter her strategy, the change would not need to be dramatic. It would not require suspicion to replace kindness, or fear to replace curiosity. It would begin with a smaller adjustment, a reassessment of how information functions in an uncertain environment. Under this shift, information is no longer treated as neutral. It becomes situational, something that can be revealed, delayed, or withheld depending on context. Conversation remains possible, but it is no longer frictionless. Each exchange carries weight. This does not imply hostility, it implies asymmetry. Little Red Riding Hood would still walk the same path. She would still encounter the same wolf. The forest would not signal danger more clearly than before. What changes is not the environment, but her interpretation of it. She no longer assumes that questions are asked for harmless reasons. When the wolf inquires about her destination, the question is no longer taken at face value. It is evaluated, not for tone or appearance, but for function. What does this question enable? What does the answer provide? Under this strategy, disclosure becomes selective. Details are compressed. Some information is deferred. Not because the wolf has revealed malicious intent, but because intent is no longer the prerequisite for caution. This is a Machiavellian adjustment in the most restrained sense. It does not require deception for its own sake. It requires an understanding that outcomes are shaped less by moral alignment than by relative awareness. One actor observing while another speaks freely creates imbalance. By limiting what is revealed, Little Red Riding Hood changes the tempo of the interaction. The wolf gains less clarity, his options narrow. He must act with less certainty or wait longer to act at all. Time, which previously worked in his favor, becomes unstable. This does not eliminate risk, it redistributes it. Silence under this strategy is not aggression, it is insulation. The goal is not to dominate the interaction, but to prevent it from becoming one-sided. Power in this context is not control over others, it is control over exposure. Machiavelli's insight is often misunderstood as an endorsement of manipulation. In practice, it is an observation about environments where cooperation cannot be assumed. In such environments, strategies built on honesty do not fail loudly, they fail quietly. They simply leak advantage. By adjusting how information is handled, Little Red Riding Hood does not become safer in an absolute sense. The forest remains unpredictable. The wolf remains capable. But the conditions under which harm can occur change. The wolf is forced to infer rather than extract, to act without confirmation, to risk acting too early or too late. The certainty that once guided him is replaced with estimation. This shift carries a cost. Interactions become slower. Trust is no longer ambient, it must be earned or simulated. The simplicity of the original strategy is lost. What is gained is not moral superiority, but resilience. The story no longer hinges entirely on one actor's openness. Outcomes become less predetermined. In this version of the story, survival depends not on obedience or purity of intent, but on calibration, on recognizing that not every environment rewards transparency equally. The change is subtle, but once made, the story cannot return to its original shape. The psychological cost. Little Red Riding Hood, Jung. A strategic shift does not occur in isolation. When behavior changes, internal alignment must adjust to support it. What begins as a practical adjustment often introduces psychological tension that did not previously exist. Under her original strategy, Little Red Riding Hood's inner world was relatively unified. Her intentions, her words, and her actions pointed in the same direction. There was little need for self-monitoring because there was little internal conflict. The world was assumed to be legible. Her role within it was clear. With the introduction of strategy, that unity begins to fracture. Selective disclosure requires awareness not only of others, but of oneself. What to say, what not to say, what might be inferred from silence. This introduces a new layer of attention that turns inward. The mind becomes an observer of its own behavior. In Jungian terms, this is the moment when the shadow becomes visible, not as something monstrous or immoral, but as a capacity that had not been used before. The capacity to withhold, to misdirect, to allow others to misunderstand. This capacity was always present. It simply had no reason to surface. Once acknowledged, it cannot be unseen. Little Red Riding Hood becomes aware that her safety may depend on abilities that do not align neatly with her self-image. She does not become deceptive by nature, but she becomes capable of deception by necessity. The wolf no longer carries the entire burden of threat. Part of that tension moves inward. Vigilance replaces ease. Awareness replaces simplicity. Each interaction now contains a question that did not previously exist. What am I allowing to be known? This awareness produces a subtle psychological cost. Innocence, when it functions as a strategy, allows the self to remain uncomplicated. When strategy replaces innocence, identity becomes layered. Behavior must be managed alongside intention. The forest, once an external space, begins to take shape internally. Uncertainty is no longer something encountered only in the world. It is carried within the character as a constant background presence. Importantly, this does not bring clarity or relief. Integration of the shadow is often described as growth. In practice, it introduces friction. The self becomes more accurate, but less comfortable. Fewer actions feel automatic, more require deliberation. Little Red Riding Hood does not become the wolf. That distinction remains intact, but the clean separation between predator and prey begins to dissolve. Not ethically, but psychologically. She recognizes that the capacity for strategic behavior is not exclusive to threats. It is a human function, activated by conditions. This recognition complicates her relationship to herself. Trust is no longer unconditional, even internally. Motives are examined, reactions are questioned. The simplicity of acting without reflection is lost. Jung's contribution here is not a prescription, but an observation. When the shadow is acknowledged, the world becomes less projected and more internalized. Danger is no longer located entirely outside the self. It becomes something navigated through awareness. The cost of this awareness is not corruption, it is tension. At this point, the story gains psychological depth, but loses psychological ease. The character is better equipped to survive, but less able to move through the world without friction. This trade-off is rarely addressed directly in retellings. Strategy is often portrayed as empowering, awareness as liberating. But within the structure of the story, what is gained externally is paid for internally. The shift protects the body. It complicates the mind. Values under pressure. Little Red Riding Hood, Nietzsche. When a strategy changes, values are not immediately replaced. They are tested. What once felt natural begins to encounter resistance, not because it is wrong, but because the conditions that supported it are no longer stable. Under her original approach, Little Red Riding Hood's values did not need to justify themselves. Honesty, openness, and trust functioned well because they aligned with a protected environment. They were reinforced by expectation rather than choice. Their strength was never measured against sustained risk. With the introduction of strategy, this insulation disappears. Nietzsche's contribution is not a rejection of morality, but an inquiry into its origins. He asks whether values arise from strength or whether they persist because they have not yet been challenged. When conditions change, values are exposed to pressure. Some adapt, others fracture. In this version of the story, innocence is no longer ambient, it becomes optional. Honesty is no longer automatic, it must compete with caution. Each value now carries a cost that was previously invisible. This does not render those values false, it reveals their dependency. If honesty increases vulnerability, does it remain a virtue, or does it become a liability? If openness accelerates danger, is restraint a betrayal of principle or an adjustment to reality? These questions are not answered by the story. They are introduced by the shift in conditions. Nietzsche's focus is not on what values claim to be, but on what they accomplish. Under pressure, values reveal whether they were chosen or merely inherited, whether they are maintained out of conviction or because no alternative was required. Little Red Riding Hood's values begin to separate from her identity. They are no longer indistinguishable from who she is. They become positions she occupies rather than assumptions she inhabits. This separation is destabilizing. Values that once felt self-evident now require justification. Some are retained despite their cost. Others are modified not because they were disproven, but because they were unsustainable under threat. Importantly, this does not create a hierarchy where strength replaces innocence. Nietzsche is often misread as advocating domination. In this context, his insight is more restrained. Values that survive pressure are not superior in a moral sense. They are simply adapted to constraint. Innocence, when supported by protection, can function as a form of strength. When protection is removed, innocence becomes exposed. This exposure does not invalidate it, it clarifies its limits. What emerges is not a new moral code, but a fragmented one. Some values persist unchanged, others bend. The coherence that once unified them is lost. The character does not abandon morality, she experiences it under load. This is the point where the story becomes uncomfortable, not because something dark has been introduced, but because something ideal has been made conditional. Values no longer float above circumstance, they are embedded within it. Nietzsche's lens does not resolve this tension, it leaves it intact. The question is not which values should remain, but which can, and at what cost. The story after the shift. Little Red Riding Hood. Once the strategic shift has taken place, the story no longer unfolds along a single moral path. It becomes conditional. Events depend less on what the characters represent and more on how they respond to uncertainty. Little Red Riding Hood still enters the forest. The destination remains the same. The wolf still appears. What changes is the texture of the narrative. Fewer moments feel inevitable, more feel contingent. Interactions slow, conversations shorten, silence begins to carry meaning. The story no longer advances through confession or disclosure, but through omission and timing. Progress is measured not by movement, but by what fails to happen. The wolf, deprived of easy access to information, must operate differently. He is no longer certain when or where advantage will appear. His actions become riskier, not because he is more aggressive, but because he knows less. The clarity that once guided him is replaced by approximation. This does not guarantee safety, it introduces volatility. In this version of the story, outcomes become probabilistic. The grandmother may still be endangered, intervention may still arrive too late. Strategy reduces exposure, it does not eliminate vulnerability. The forest remains indifferent to preparation. What is lost is the clean arc of the original tale. There is no single moment where innocence clearly fails or virtue is decisively rewarded. Instead, there is a series of smaller adjustments. Each carries minor consequences. Over time, they accumulate. The story becomes less symbolic and more procedural. Little Red Riding Hood's survival, if it occurs, does not feel like a moral victory. It feels circumstantial. It depends on timing, restraint, and the limits of the wolf's patience. If she fails, it is not framed as punishment. It is understood as miscalculation. The absence of moral clarity alters how the ending is experienced. Relief, if present, is quieter. Loss, if it occurs, is less instructive. The story no longer teaches, it records. This version of the narrative resists simplification. There is no clear message to extract, and no behavior to model without question. What remains is a pattern of interaction shaped by constraint rather than intention. By the time the story concludes, the forest has not revealed its meaning. It has only revealed its conditions. The characters adapt to those conditions with varying success. What replaces the original lesson is not cynicism, but ambiguity. The story does not argue that innocence is dangerous or that strategy is superior. It shows how each operates under pressure and how neither offers certainty. In this form, the tale no longer resolves tension by restoring order. It ends with balance temporarily restored, aware that it could shift again. The story becomes less comforting, but more precise. Closing observation. Little Red Riding Hood. By the end of this version of the story, nothing definitive has been proven. Innocence has not been condemned, strategy has not been celebrated. The forest remains what it always was, a space where outcomes depend on alignment between assumptions and conditions. What has changed is not the world, it is the character's relationship to it. Little Red Riding Hood does not emerge wiser in a triumphant sense. She emerges more aware. That awareness does not guarantee safety. It introduces responsibility. Choices now carry weight they did not carry before. They are made with an understanding of consequence rather than expectation. The story resists becoming a lesson. It offers no instruction that can be transferred cleanly to other contexts. It does not suggest that honesty should be abandoned or that caution should dominate. It only shows that strategies function differently depending on where they are applied. In this light, the forest is not a moral test. It is a constraint. It applies pressure evenly without regard for intention. Characters respond to that pressure with the tools they have available at the time. When innocence encounters strategy, the result is not corruption, it is complexity. The story becomes harder to summarize, but easier to recognize. It begins to resemble situations where clarity is partial, trust is conditional, and outcomes are uncertain. The tale ends without restoring simplicity. What remains is an awareness that once assumptions are examined, they cannot be returned to their original state. The path still exists, the destination still matters, but the journey is no longer guided by expectation alone. Until the next observation.